Today is the 22nd Sunday since Pentecost. It is the 33rd Sunday in the church year, and it is our first Sunday in our 29th year of ministry. It is the 21st Sunday of marriage equality in New York State, November 13, 2011. And this sermon will be coming to you from Ray of Hope Church of our Lord Jesus Christ, the first church founded and consistently supported by the LGBTQIS community in central New York with ministry in Syracuse, Ithaca, and Elmira. We are counting every Sunday, or every week, of marriage equality in New York State until the entire country has marriage equality. And we sort of jest to, in a sort of way, to say, well, we wonder how many Sundays we'll have to count. Well, I wonder how many of you know that we actually moved closer to that this week. On November 10th, the Senate Judiciary Committee advanced the Respect for Marriage Act. And this is good because it has moved out of committee now, and now it becomes part of the Senate agenda. That's another whole issue. But we will talk more about that today in the sermon because it is an advance forward, and it's a very significant one. And Senator Dianne Feinstein, who is the original author of the Respect for Marriage Act, which is an act that will reverse the negative implications of the so-called DOMA. We'll talk more about that. She was on the City Board of Supervisors with Harvey Milk when he was assassinated back in 1978. In fact, I believe she may have been the chairperson or the president of the City Board of Supervisors. And she has stayed the course with her work for equality for all persons. And she is the author of this great piece of legislation which will reverse DOMA. So we'll talk more about that. So there's been a movement forward this week, and we want to celebrate that, and we want to stand with that, because many communities that are so-called communities of faith are already speaking out against the Respect for Marriage Act. Isn't that an interesting thought? The church communities are speaking against the Respect for Marriage Act. So faith communities like ours, who believe that persons are called together of every gender and sexual orientation, we want to stand together, and we want to stand up publicly as well and say, no, this is a good thing, and this is God's will. So we have an opportunity this week to now write to our own representatives and thank them for this work and encourage them now to move it forward. Now, another great thing happened this week. Here in the city of Elmira, New York, we elected Susan Skidmore as our next mayor. And while we are not allowed to endorse candidates by law, we can certainly celebrate the victory once an election is done. And why would we celebrate this particular victory? Well, you may remember that we had protests going on here in Elmira for a number of years on Thursday evenings. They were protests by self-named, self-proclaimed, self-appointed, so-called conservative, so-called Christians, every Thursday night out there on the corner of Church and Main, and they were protesting against specifically same-sex marriage in New York State. Well, a counter-protest movement also emerged, and these were people who supported same-sex marriage. And we here in this church were very pleasantly surprised to find out that almost all of the counter-protesters were themselves heterosexual persons and some bisexual persons. In fact, I don't remember any gay person at all until we got involved in it. And even more surprising, as God's sense of humor often is, the organizers to the counter-protest happened to live right across the street. We didn't even realize that. Well, Susan Skidmore was one of the participants in the counter-protest movement. And she also was involved in city politics at the time. And she switched from the Republican to the Democratic Party after she was elected. Was it to the council?
That night.
Yeah. After she was elected, she switched parties, and it was largely over this issue. And now, Mrs. Skidmore has been elected to be our next mayor. So, you know, lots of times when people hear that we're in Elmira, New York, they go, how can that possibly be? Well, actually, Elmira does have a progressive story, and has, you know, since its beginning. So there have been times when things have gone in a more difficult direction, shall we say, but the overall story of Elmira, New York actually is a progressive story. And so we are celebrating the election of our next mayor, and just goes to show you that this is God's rainbow parade, folks. God is at the head of the parade. And although there have been many setbacks, ultimately God is going to get God's will. And what is that? Well, it's like I said a few weeks ago on October 2nd at World Communion Sunday. When Peter stood up on the first day of the church, he quoted the prophet Joel. I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. And that's exactly what's happening in these days. And the church has just got to get with the program. That's all there is to it. And the church has got to wake up and line up with God's will. So we're very happy for these things, and we'll say more about them today. And I think you'll find our readings very interesting today, as they do, in fact, line up with these issues. So let us begin by giving God thanks and praise. The readings today start the turn toward eschatology, which is the study of the end times. Because very soon, much sooner than I'm ready for, we will be in the season of Advent, which 4 weeks following is the season of Christmas and the Nativity. But during that season of Advent in particular, the church readings look at the end times. This starts today with these readings. Now, for those of you who are only hearing the sermon on the internet, you may want to stop at this point and read the readings which are now showing on your screen. And in the first reading, the reading in Proverbs 31 verses 10 to 31, we read that reading not as only referring to women, the perfect wife, but we read that reading as the perfect companion, the perfect spouse, taking the gender aspect away. So if you choose to stop and read the readings at this time, please read Proverbs 31 from that point of view. But this spousal relationship that's mentioned in the first reading is also about the church. And that's why it's connected to these last two readings, the 1 Thessalonians and the Gospel reading today, which are specifically about the return of the Lord at the end time. St. Paul warns in 1 Thessalonians that this event is truly going to happen. And it's going to happen like a thief in the night, which was the theme of a very poor series of movies that were shown in many churches in the 1970s. You can still find it. It's called Thief in the Night, referring to the rapture. But this is even bigger than that. What this is saying is, just when the church believes that, you know, the Lord is not going to ever return, and therefore it can carry on and do whatever it wants to do, and some say, well, you know, the Lord's not ever really going to return, so we're just going to become another social service institution, and they're going crazy to be social service institutions. Other churches believe the Lord might return at some point, but only after the whole world is white, Anglo-Saxon, conservative, Protestant type of Christianity. And so they're deeply involved in politics, and they call themselves the religious right. And that's a double meaning there, because they want that to sound like the religious correct. Okay? And so they're deeply involved in politics. And Then others believe that they're supposed to be establishing the kingdom now on the earth, and this is the papal agenda, or this is the Mormon agenda. So I have often said that to understand the entire preaching agenda of any church, you have to first find out how they interpret the end times, because that really will bounce backwards on everything they're doing. So the parable of the talents then, which is Matthew 25 verses 14 to 30, can seem harsh when you read it, because if it's taken to refer to poverty and riches, it sounds ridiculous. You know, this person, the landowner, gives out, we'll say, investments to the slaves, and then they all go and invest it differently. Well, the one is a conservative and is afraid. Now, you'll notice with our modern so-called self-appointed, self-named conservatives, their agenda often is an agenda of fear. And they're always trying to scare us. Something is going to happen. Therefore, tighten down, you know, pull in, don't spend, be careful. We're going to, you know, defend ourselves because terrible things are coming. You remember in this last presidential election cycle, what did we keep hearing over and over again? 9/11, 9/11, 9/11, 9/11, 9/11. And no matter where you turn, it was 9/11. You know, they're trying to scare us into the idea. And somebody actually said that this president, maybe some of you remember who this was, somebody actually said that this president, as soon as he was elected, was going to be immediately challenged at an international level, you know, if they elected Barack Obama, and that he would fail. And so there was this fear, don't elect him, because if you do, you know, the countries that are against the United States were going to launch an international attack, and he would be tested immediately on his watch, which of course didn't happen. But it was all based on fear. So this one servant goes and takes the gift from the master, and he goes and buries it. Because he says, there, now it's safe. No one can touch it. I don't have to be afraid of anything. It's good and it's safe. He doesn't do any investing. He doesn't do any risking. While the other two, one sort of goes out and takes the gift and invests it a little bit, and it does increase somewhat. The third one goes out and radically invests the gift. Well, when the landowner comes back, the one he's most pleased with is the one who radically invested. Secondarily, the one who sort of. The one he's most disappointed with is the one who ran out there and out of fear protected and battened it down and all of this. How does that apply to the church? We've been invested with the gospel. We've been given the gospel message. What have we done with the gospel message as the spouse of the Lord Jesus Christ? Or in a much more bigger field, as the human community in its relationship with God. God has given us creation. God has given us God's message. God has given us the scriptures. What have we done with this? Have we battened it down and we made it a gospel of fear? Have we tried to scare the hell out of people? That didn't work in the century that was tried. Did we try it with fire and brimstone preaching? That didn't work. Did we try it with moral codes and Father knows best? In the 40s and 50s, that didn't work either. Or you go way back to the Middle Ages, you can look at all the different periods of the church. Those who took the fear approach, what did fear result in? Disaster and more fear. And certainly never did it result in authentic faith. It never has. You're following this? And so that's the third servant, who took the thing and went, no, careful, careful, hide, fear, afraid. The question is, you know, how do we see the other two servants? One invests a little bit. Okay, well, first of all, if you invest your master's talent, the first thing you realize is, it's not really yours. It's whose? It's the guy that gave it to you. See, this is the problem that some churches have done. They've taken the gospel and they've made it themselves. How do you know? Well, you say to somebody, are you a believer? And they come back with, I'm a Lutheran. Are you a believer? I'm a Methodist. So in other words, their faith is not them, it's the thing. And as much as they try to become the thing, the faith becomes inauthentic. It's like I said a few weeks ago over at the World Communion Service. I said, we don't go to church, we are the church. And if you check that video, some people said, amen. I was really a little surprised, to tell you the truth. But apparently they had discussed that before, you know, and they understood that. Well, that's a congregation that just made a huge investment, by the way. They had this building from the 1800s over here, which was costing them upwards of $20,000 to $35,000 a year in utilities. So what do? They go and build another building, a smaller one, a brand new construction that's radically different from the one they had. And they talked about they talked about escaping the edifice complex, a little play on a Greek idea. The edifice complex, they didn't want to, you know, stay with this building no matter what. Okay? So they went and they invested a lot of money and they built a smaller building. And their faith is flourishing together over there. But they have to let go of the thing. You see? Well, that's what we have to do with the gospel. Inasmuch as we start to own it and say it's ours, then we lose sight of the real owner. And so we'll invest cautiously the gospel. What we want to do is be the radical, the one servant who radically took what the master gave him and went out there and, let's take the words of Jesus, sowed the seeds, cultivated them, watered them, graced them. Oh, you're talking about church membership. No, actually I'm not. Not at all. Not even slightly. What I'm talking about are the gospel principles. And all of these principles are found in that first reading, which some churches will make fun of women with today. But what does the perfect spouse do? The perfect spouse just gives themselves completely to the agenda of that family unit and just goes and just does. You know, how many of us could have seen where we are today and what we're doing today when we were 12 years old? But as we came up through our adulthood and we continued to pray and we continued to seek the Holy Spirit, the Lord asked us to do more, different, maybe not what we planned. Wow, that was a surprise. But as long as we stay with it, we can look back over the whole thing and say, I can now see how God was working in all of that. And hopefully, we've grown and those around us have grown. So the investment that we've been given then is the gospel. And we've been talking a lot about what the gospel really is. It's not about how many people you save. It's not possible for a church or a minister, priest, prophet, or pope to save anybody. What it's about is how we proclaim this incredible just God that gives us life and gives us freedom to live it fully and to be aware of God's presence and to share that. And what happens, we find out, as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning bisexual persons and our straight allies, we find out that this even comes into our relationships. And it's been a difficult journey because those who took the talent and buried it down and they're trying to keep it in this little box have been shouting and screaming at us for the last 45 years, saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, stop it. There's no way that God could be approving of relationships. There's no way the state should let you live together. There's no way the state should let you have an apartment. There's no way you should own land. You can't adopt. No, stop, stop, stop. That's the guy that took the talent and is burying it down here and is trying to protect it. That person's going to be very surprised when the Lord returns. Because you know what's happened? They've actually missed the boat. While they're so busy with the gospel of hate, and they're so busy telling everybody who's not saved and couldn't possibly be saved and couldn't possibly be going to heaven, and they build the whole church structure around that, That's their investment. They can't get out of it. They're stuck over here. And what's happened is they've missed everything that the Spirit's been doing over here. I think the United Church of Christ happens to be one of the best examples of an institution that went from a very conservative, sort of conservative position and has actually been way out ahead of all the other mainline churches. The United Church of Christ has welcomed gay and lesbian persons for years, and has had open ordination for gay and lesbian persons for years, and transgender people. And to date, they're the only mainline denomination that offers scholarships for LGBT persons to go to seminary. And they started as Congregationalists. Now true, the Congregational Church was a progressive church at some levels, but it was also a very conservative church. C.I. Schofield was a Congregational pastor in Dallas, Texas. Okay, so within the Congregational body, you had very, very conservative and liberal persons. That is really the foundational denomination that formed the United Church of Christ as it is today. That's an example. All that's been going on over here, but these people over here with their, oh no, can't be, have missed even all of that. And they've missed the work of MCC and all the other denominations and churches that have grown up over all these years. So, as the Spirit continues to work, we want to join that first representative, that first person, that first slave servant, okay? We want to get out there with that one who's investing the gospel in every way. And you know what? Jesus said to Nicodemus, who was representative of the established religion, he said to him, Nicodemus, ease up, relax. You know when the wind blows that you can't tell where it came from or where it's going. So it is with those who are filled with the Spirit. See, and then Paul did all that preaching trying to help the Jewish people realize, let go of those established ways. It's time to move past that. It was good. The law was your tutor. The law brought you to where you are, but now go with the Holy Spirit. Let the Spirit guide you. Well, that was tough. Because laws you can understand. Laws you can look them up and say, okay, now I do this, now I do that, now I do this. But with the Spirit, it's not so cut and dry all the time. The Spirit is like the wind. The Spirit is like the waves. Okay? And either you go with it or you fight it. And so, in the church then, we have to listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. You notice we keep coming back to the same thing. What is the Spirit saying to the churches? And so, as this whole thing moves on for the United States of America, trying to live up to its own motto, liberty and justice for all, the Spirit of God is going along with that. Because that liberty and justice for all is really the gospel. It really is. For everyone. And so here in our own time, we have this battle going on as people are rising up to say, look, I am who God made me to be. I love the person that God gave me to love. We are living the life that God gave us to live. And finally what's happened here, it is actually the government, which is a bit surprising, that's actually going to fix the problem. The church is not going to fix the problem. The government actually is. Because there are people in government now who are looking at this and saying, you know what? These people pay the same taxes as these people. These people pay into the same retirement systems as these people. These people own land just like these people. Then why are we treating them differently? And the church says, well, because it's against God's will. And unfortunately, this group over here that took the investment and pounded it down into the ground and said, there, we've got it. It's exactly the way Christ gave it to us, and it will be right there when He comes back. So help me God. Those people are over here trying to tell the government, You are behaving in a sinful way. Your government is immoral. You're not listening to God. In fact, our Supreme Court just told the Westboro Baptist Church they have every right to go out there and protest and hold up signs, God hates fags. Now how can that be? How did that really happen? That'll get overturned. It's going to take a while, but people are going to come to their senses and realize how foolish that was. What's happening now is we're getting people into government who are looking at this from a justice point of view, and they're saying, wait a minute, how is it that we're letting these religionists guide us to discriminate against a whole huge population of people? And huge it is. This week, like we said, the Senate Judiciary Committee advanced the Respect for Marriage Act on November 10th. The ACLU has an interesting article on this, and the web link for that will now appear on your screen. It says, for immediate release, the State Judiciary Committee today passed the Respect for Marriage Act, a bill that would repeal the Discriminatory Defense of Marriage Act, so named DOMA. Earlier this year, the Obama administration announced that it would not defend DOMA in any legal challenge, including a lawsuit brought on behalf of Edie Windsor, who was forced to pay $363,000 tax on the estate of her late spouse, Thea Spear. Windsor would not have had to pay the tax if she had been married to a man. Get that now? Because her spouse was a woman, she had to pay this $363,000 tax. Had she been married to a man, she wouldn't have had to pay it. That's what makes it unjust. Regardless of what the church says, there's a lack of justice there. Today's vote is an important step forward for the over 80,000 married same-sex couples across the country. 80,000 married same-sex couples across the country, said Ian Thompson, ACLU legislative representative. Quoting again, these couples have made the commitment at the heart of marriage and exchange vows under state law. For the federal government to exclude them from all federal protections for their marriage is unjust, unnecessary, and unconstitutional. It's time for Congress to join the President and the Department of Justice in rejecting this discriminatory law. Now, here is, I believe this is Edie Windsor quoted here. I shared my life with my beloved late spouse in sickness and in health for 44 years. Yes, like any other devoted married couple, Windsor explained. In the midst of coping with Thea's death, it is hard to describe how painful it was for my own government to treat me as though we were mere strangers and not spouses. Losing a spouse is obviously a terrible thing for anyone to experience. Congress should pass this bill to prevent others from having to go through what we had to deal with. There you go. And so, it is exactly about the faithful spouse, isn't it? And so, it is exactly about the true meaning of the gospel, liberation and freedom for all, isn't it? And it is also about the end time. Because while some denominations hunker down on this, and refuse to listen to what the Spirit is saying, the age of the church has a definite ending. It's an ending unknown to us. That day is coming. And when it comes, the Lord is going to look at the church and say, how did you handle my gospel? Did you go out there and make it a gospel of hate? Did you go out there and make it a gospel in such a way that people lost their lives, people were burned at stakes, put into electric chairs, people are being unjustly executed? What did you do with my gospel? Or did you go out there and invest it in the way that I would have? Did you proclaim the freedom and liberation of the love of God? That day is coming. Churches need to wake up and get on the right, correct side of this issue. Now, also appearing on your screen now is another web link from Think Progress. It says here, moments ago, in a vote of 10 to 8, 10 to 8, is that not a close vote? It is. The Senate Judiciary Committee reported out the Respect for Marriage Act, which would repeal the Defense of Marriage Act and allow the federal government to provide benefits to couples in same-sex marriages. It's not clear when the Senate will take up the measure, that's for sure. And we need to carefully time that. This has everything to do with who we elect this coming November 2012. Has everything to do with it. If there's any question in your mind which party is supporting liberty and justice for all, and which party is doing everything it can to stop the advance of the rights of all Americans, read these articles. Clearly, every argument made against the repeal of DOMA is made by one party and one party only. And every one of their arguments are so ridiculous and so falsely based in a veiled way on religion. I'm not going to put Ray of Hope's tax exemption and religious status at risk by naming the party. But it would take an idiot to not know what party it is. And if you don't know, get educated. Read the articles that we're putting on the screen today. Look at the YouTube videos that will go on this sermon, and there'll be no question in your mind. If you sit home next November and allow that party to take over the executive and the Congress, branches of government, not only will there be no further advances for LGBT persons, but they're going to reverse the advances that have been made. This is very serious. And our Supreme Court, the next President of the United States, will undoubtedly appoint at least one, if not two, Supreme Court judges. Now that's something that's in our structure of government that the President appoints. Okay? The Supreme Court is already tilted in a conservative direction. If the remaining progressive or moderate judges do not get some help, we're done, at least in our lifetimes. And I bring this up because it's interesting that the readings today give us a sense of urgency. The readings today remind us, church, do not think that you have all the time, forever and ever, to get along with this gospel. The Lord wants us to move on this and keep things moving. Not to be lax and lazy, not to be the Laodicean, lukewarm church of the book of Revelation, but to be hot for the gospel, to be on fire to advance the Lord's will. Well, then, the White House gave an update. This is on the same link from Think Progress. A White House spokesman just issued the following statement. President Obama applauds today's vote by the Senate Judiciary Committee to approve the Respect for Marriage Act, which will provide a legislative repeal of the so-called Defense of Marriage Act. Notice the so-called. The President has long believed that DOMA is discriminatory and has called for its repeal. We should all work toward taking this law off the books. The federal government should not deny gay and lesbian couples the same rights and legal protections afforded to straight couples. Why is it that President Obama has not brought about these changes by executive order? Because if he does that, then nobody else has to take responsibility for the corrections that are needed in our society. And everybody can then just make him the point person and say, well, that's easy, just get rid of him. And have the next president come in and reverse the executive orders. And so it becomes a battle of presidents.
But there's another issue though there.
Not for the cameras.
If you have a law, the president can't contradict the law.
That's right.
So even if he wants to do it, he couldn't do an executive order to contradict that.
Okay, all right. So he can't do an executive order against a standing law.
Exactly.
Right, okay. And so a lot of people have said, you know, he's too slow, he's too, you know, he's not moving fast. But he's doing the right thing because he's forcing the society to make the corrections. And again, if we are taking the investment of the gospel that's been given to us seriously, if we really believe that God sees all persons equal, if we really believe that God sees all genders as equal, if we really believe that all sexual orientations are gifts from God, then we need to step up to the plate and help those who are trying to bring these laws now into place, not only for our own country, but internationally. That's how we take the investment and cultivate it. That's how this is directly related to these readings again today. Well, I just want to bring up the response of the conservative side because it was just as quick. I'm now going to put up a link on the internet at this during this sermon. And this was written by Deacon Keith Fournier, I believe. Fournier, Fournier. And the article came out on the 4th of November in anticipation of the vote that was coming up. It says, oppose the Respect for Marriage Act. Defend marriage, family, the common good. So here you go. Written by a deacon. All right? So here's a person now that's going to say, God disagrees with all of this. God does not want LGBTQ, intersex persons, and their straight allies to have the same rights as everybody else. God disagrees. Like the Westboro Baptist Church, God hates fags. So don't let anything advance forward. Now, this is a deacon of the Roman Catholic Church. This is no small organization here. And deacons in the Roman Catholic Church are clergy and speak with the same authority as the bishop. So this is not a light article. This is a serious matter. And one of the terms that comes out in this article, which is again on the screen right now, so you can read it, is a term that I've never seen before, and I wonder if any of you have ever seen this. Have you heard this theme, the homosexual equivalency movement? Has anybody heard that before? This sounds to me like a new term that they're trying to rev up here. The homosexual equivalency movement. From the article. The leaders of the homosexual equivalency movement insist that homosexual sexual practices are morally equivalent to the sexual expression of marital love between a man and a woman. They now go further by insisting that every state make homosexual relationships legally equivalent to marriage. They are dedicated to building a society where the positive law of the nation forces us all to call to be a marriage what can never be a marriage, or face the police power of the state and sanctions. The truth about marriage is not simply a religious construct. The natural law, with a capital N and a capital L, the natural law reveals, and the cross-cultural history of civilization affirms, that marriage is between a man and a woman, open to children, and intended for life. Marriage is the foundation for the family, which is the privileged place for the formation of virtue and character in children, our future citizens. The family is the first society, first economy, first school, first civilizing and mediating institution, and first government. This bill is a perfect example of the Orwellian newspeak accompanying the cultural revolution being waged by the homosexual equivalency movement. There are now two conflicting visions of the human person: human freedom, human flourishing, and marriage, and the family, founded upon it as the first cell of a truly just society in the West. This legislation, calling itself Respect for Marriage Act of 2011, eviscerates the protections of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA, which defines marriage as the union of one man and one woman for purposes of federal law and policy. It will force every state to recognize homosexual unions as marriages, as if the state from which the homosexual partners come from calls them marriages. This has been the legal strategy of the homosexual equivalency activists, and those are all capital letters, H, E, and A, homosexual equivalency activists all along. There is an accelerating effort to force us to recognize homosexual partnerships as the moral and legal equivalent of marriage, and then use the police power, capital P and capital P, police power of the state to enforce such a reconstructing of the social order on the rest of civil society. Notice the fear. Notice the hunkering down. Notice the "don't touch my investment." We know what the gospel is. You are interfering with it. Notice no listening at all to what the Spirit might be saying to the churches. Now there's a very powerful term that was in there, only one that I'm going to talk about for a second here. Natural law. Capital N and capital L. Sounds ominous, doesn't it? What is natural law? Who knows? The assumption is that you do. It's in a public article. Natural law is a product of the philosophers of the 13th century, philosopher-theologians, the scholastic theologians. St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologica is the primary source of so-called natural law. It is a use of philosophy theory to force theology into new dogmas, and sometimes they're represented as doctrines. And they were enforced upon the entire High Middle Ages society. It was only in the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment that people started pushing back against those dogmas and teachings of the church that were pushed all the way up to the highest levels of government in the medieval society. Basically, the church was the government of the medieval society. That may not have been so bad if it was governing based upon the doctrines of the Bible, but instead it was governing upon these philosophical theological theories which formed the dogmatic constitution of the Western Church. Those are huge words, I know. But if you go back to the sermon, which is now appearing on your screen, we explained the difference between doctrines, dogmas, teachings, and practices. This deacon is putting this word natural law out here as a title, knowing full well the public has no clue what this is talking about. But it sounds so organic. It sounds so foundational, the natural law. It must be like the earth going around the sun. That must be natural law. So obviously it's unnatural for a man to love a man. They know that that's how people are interpreting this. They realize you have no clue what they're talking about when they use the term natural law.
But when natural law was conceived, they thought the sun went around the earth.
Yeah, yeah. But you see, they know that the public has very little training in philosophy. And so they're using this big ominous term, and they write to the Congress and the Senate, you know, and the House of Representatives using these terms, and they put this fear. And so, you know, the guy that's elected to office, he probably doesn't have a theological education, although some of them do. You know, and they read it, oh, you know, the church says, oh, the Pope says, oh, Billy Graham says, oh, the Mormon prophet says, oh, I better be careful. I vote no. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to scare our representatives. And you know what? When the representatives only hear from these people, and they don't hear from persons of faith like ourselves, who realize this is bunk, then what do we expect except that they're going to vote out of fear on the side of the priests, prophets, popes, and pastors, the PP people? When those people use fear, and that's all our representatives hear from, that's what guides many of them. And so, we've been given the gospel. It's been invested in us. Right now, the Spirit is calling us to action. If we really believe in liberty and justice for all, then we have to participate in the process. Because those who have taken the gospel and done this with it, they are participating in the process. We've been talking all about them. And they've stolen words like religious right. Sounds moral. Sounds like the religious and the correct. And they call us the religious left, like the leftover. Okay? Get rid of that terminology. Don't play their game, but participate in the process. Write to your representatives. Get involved. We did it. We elected a person who understands this as our mayor. Okay? We've got some city council offices we're not quite sure about yet. Okay? We have a good governor right now who understands this in New York State. We've got a president who understands this. If you really want to fight for those who need our help, the children, aren't we tired of children hearing these lies? Aren't we tired of children being tortured by pastors and priests and popes? If we are, if we want to end this discrimination that we grew up with, then we've got to do everything we can to free this society up. And you know what? You're not leaving your faith at the door. You're actually bringing the real gospel to our society. We're not leaving our faith at the door. You do not need to become an atheist to be a progressive. And there's nothing wrong with being atheist. Nothing. But a lot of churches, you know, a lot of gay and lesbian people believe they had to leave the church to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, to be who they are. No, you don't. Our faith calls us into action. Our faith calls us to the front of the rainbow parade. It's God's rainbow, it's God's rainbow parade, and nothing is going to stop it. So let's not sit on the sidelines. Write to Dianne Feinstein this week. Thank her for her courageous work. Thank her for not letting the memory of Harvey Milk just disappear. That woman was there. She is the one who gave the news conference to announce that Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk had been assassinated. That woman, go get the movie Milk and see the footage. That woman is the woman who wrote the Respect for Marriage Act, and she is standing up. Remember, she's a woman. That alone, in the 1930s and 40s, would have been impossible. Okay? So there's a lot going on. There's a lot to thank God for. And it's happening. Either we stand on the sidelines and say, well, that was nice. But how about get off the sidelines, get into the parade, take the Lord's insignia, which is the rainbow, and say, liberty and justice for all in the name of God. That's what the church is calling us to, And that is what the Spirit is saying to the churches today.